I've always believed that true wealth isn't measured by the money in your bank account, but by the love and respect shared between family members. The bonds we forge, the trust we build, the memories we create. These are the foundations of a rich life. That's why when my husband's family ambushed me at our anniversary dinner with a prenuptial agreement and accusations of being a gold digger, I realized some misconceptions run deeper than blood. What they didn't know was that the sprawling Westbrook, estate they were so desperate to protect from me, had actually been mine all along, purchased quietly through my investment firm years before I ever met their son. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I remember that evening as if it were etched into my soul, with diamond precision. James and I were celebrating our 5th wedding anniversary at Luminescence, the upscale restaurant where we'd had our first date. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the white linen tablecloths, the soft melody of a piano creating the perfect backdrop for what should have been a romantic milestone celebration. I'd spent hours getting ready, selecting a deep burgundy dress that James had always loved, arranging my dark hair in the elegant updo he found so sophisticated. 5 years of marriage to the kindest, most genuine man I'd ever known. 5 years of building a life together despite his family's thinly veiled disapproval of me, the woman with mysterious means who came from nowhere important. If only they knew. James was unusually quiet that evening, his fingers tapping nervously against his water glass, his eyes darting toward the entrance every few minutes. I reached across the table, brushing my fingers against his. "Everything okay, love?" I asked, concern creeping into my voice. He squeezed my hand, a forced smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Of course, Elise, just excited about tonight." I should have recognized the tension in his shoulders, the slight tremor in his voice, signs I'd become adept at reading during my years negotiating multi-million-dollar real estate acquisitions. But this was James, my husband, the one person I'd allowed myself to be completely vulnerable with after a lifetime of calculated precision. That was my first mistake. The waiter had just poured our wine when I sensed a shift in the atmosphere. James straightened in his chair, his expression a mixture of resignation and apology. Before I could question it, they approached. Patricia and Richard Westbrook, my in-laws, flanked by a stern-looking man in an impeccable suit carrying a leather portfolio. "Darling," Patricia's voice dripped with artificial sweetness as she air-kissed my cheek. "Such a lovely surprise running into you here." "A surprise, of course." As if the Westbrooks ever did anything without meticulous planning. James stood, discomfort radiating from every pore. "Mother, father, what are you doing here? We're celebrating our anniversary. And what better time to secure the family's future?" Richard Westbrook's commanding voice carried the authority of 3 generations of old money and unearned privilege. He gestured to the serious man beside him. "This is Mr. Harrington, our family attorney." The attorney placed his portfolio on our table, disrupting the careful arrangement of silverware. "Mrs. Westbrook, I've prepared a post-nuptial agreement that requires your immediate attention." I sat perfectly still, my expression betraying nothing as my mind processed what was happening. 5 years. They had waited 5 years into our marriage to ambush me like this. "A post-nuptial agreement?" I repeated, my voice calm despite the storm brewing inside me. "On our anniversary dinner?" Patricia's perfectly painted lips curved into a smile that never touched her eyes. "We've been patient, Elise. Far more patient than most families would be with someone of your background. But with James' position to take over as CEO of Westbrook Holdings next month, we can no longer ignore the risk you pose to our family. Legacy. I turned to James, searching his face for any sign of the man I'd married, the one who had promised to stand by my side against his family's prejudices. Did you know about this? His eyes dropped to the table. They're just trying to protect what's been in our family for generations, Elise. It's standard procedure. Standard procedure, I echoed, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. Like inviting your spouse to an anniversary dinner only to ambush them with family lawyers? Mr. Harrington cleared his throat, unfazed by the tension. The agreement simply states that in the event of a divorce, you relinquish all claims to Westbrook properties, holdings, and assets. Given that you brought no substantial assets into this marriage, this should be a straightforward matter. No substantial assets. If only they knew the truth about exactly who they were dealing with. Richard leaned forward, his voice lowered as if sharing a confidence. Let's be honest here, Elise. We all know what attracted you to James. A woman from your circumstances doesn't marry into a family like ours without certain expectations. This simply ensures those expectations don't extend to our family's estate. The restaurant continued to bustle around us, other diners enjoying their meals, oblivious to the quiet destruction of my marriage occurring at table 12. I felt a familiar coldness settle over me, the same detached calculation that had helped me build my fortune after escaping a childhood defined by poverty and neglect. And what exactly are my circumstances, Richard? I asked, my voice steady. Patricia interjected, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she waved dismissively. Don't play coy, dear. No family connections. No prestigious education we could verify. No clear source of income before meeting James. Then suddenly, you're dressing in designer clothes and presenting yourself as someone of substance. She gave me a pitying look. We've dealt with gold diggers before, though I must admit, none who managed to make it to the altar. I carefully folded my napkin and placed it beside my untouched plate. I see. I turned to James, who at least had the decency to look ashamed. And this is what you believe as well? That I married you for your family's money? Of course not, he started. But the conviction in his voice wavered. But you have to understand their concerns. The Westbrook estate has been in the family for generations. The holdings, the investments, it's not just wealth, it's a legacy. A legacy, I repeated softly, and one I couldn't possibly understand, being from my circumstances. The attorney pushed a document across the table. If you could just sign here, we can all get back to enjoying the evening. I looked at the paper, then at the faces around me. Richard's smug certainty, Patricia's thinly veiled contempt, James's conflicted guilt, and Mr. Harrington's professional indifference. 5 years of marriage, and this was what they thought of me. This was what my husband allowed them to think. Something shifted inside me then, a decision crystallizing with perfect clarity. I had spent my entire life hiding who I truly was, playing small to make others comfortable, concealing my success to protect fragile egos. I had hidden my wealth from James when we first met because I wanted to be loved for myself, not my fortune. Then I kept the truth hidden because he seemed so proud to be the provider, so invested in the traditional role his family expected. But enough was enough. I stood slowly, gathering my purse and wrap. I don't think I'll be signing anything tonight. Patricia's expression hardened. Don't be difficult, Elise. This changes nothing about your lifestyle. You'll still have access to James's income. a generous monthly allowance. You simply won't be entitled to assets you did nothing to build. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I let out a small laugh, not of humor, but of absolute disbelief. An allowance. How generous of you to offer me an allowance for being the wife of your son, the partner who has supported his career advancement, managed your charitable foundation, and redesigned your family's outdated public image. Richard's face reddened. Now see here. No, Richard, you see here. I straightened to my full height, channeling the authority that had earned me the nickname the architect in investment circles. I have tolerated your condescension, your thinly veiled insults, and your assumptions about my worth because James asked me to give you time to see who I really am. 5 years, it seems, was not enough time. James reached for my hand. Elise, please. They're just trying to protect what's ours. What's yours? I corrected, gently removing his touch. What's abundantly clear is that I have never been considered part of that ours. And do you know what's truly ironic about this entire situation? I retrieved my phone, tapped a few commands, and then set it on the table. Ellis Investment Group. Perhaps you've heard of it. The private equity firm that's been systematically acquiring undervalued historic properties across New England for the past decade. Richard scoffed. Of course we've heard of it. Maxwell Ellis is one of the most successful investors in the region. What does that have to do with anything? Ellis Investment Group purchased the property housing Westbrook estate 8 years ago. I continued, my voice steady, along with the surrounding 500 acres. The previous owner, your second cousin twice removed, I believe, was in significant debt and quietly sold it to avoid public embarrassment. You've been leasing the property from Ellis Investment ever since, though I doubt you've bothered to read the fine print of the arrangement. Patricia's face had gone pale. That's impossible. The estate has been in the Westbrook family for 3 generations, yes. Until it wasn't. I turned my phone to face them, displaying documentation that confirmed everything I'd just said. The holding company listed on your lease agreement, Athena Properties, that's a subsidiary of Ellis Investment Group. The attorney was frantically searching through his documents, his professional demeanor cracking as he verified my claims. But Maxwell Ellis is, Richard began, confusion clouding his features. A reclusive investor who never appears in public, I finished for him. A mysterious figure who conducts all business through representatives and shell companies. I gave them a moment to connect the dots. My mother's maiden name was Ellis. Maxwell is my middle name. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ambient restaurant noise seemed to fade as the Westbrooks processed what I was telling them. You're Maxwell Ellis? James whispered, shock evident in every syllable. I built my first investment portfolio at 19 after putting myself through night school, I explained, surprising myself with how calm I felt now that the truth was finally emerging. By 23, I had acquired my first commercial property. By 27, when I met you, Ellis Investment Group managed assets worth over $300 million. Patricia collapsed into an empty chair, her aristocratic composure shattered. But you never said anything. You let us believe. I let you believe what you wanted to believe, I corrected her. I showed up at your country club, in designer clothes I could easily afford, and you assumed I was trying to appear wealthy to trap your son. I spoke knowledgeably about investments, And you assumed I had researched your family's holdings to better position myself as a gold digger. I redesigned your family's charitable foundation, pro bono, I might add. And you took it as evidence I was trying to ingratiate myself with your social circle. I looked directly at James, whose face reflected a devastation that would have broken my heart just hours earlier. I didn't tell you because I wanted to be loved for myself, not my money. And then I didn't tell you because you seemed so proud to be supporting us, so invested in the traditional dynamic your family valued. I shook my head softly. I realize now that was a mistake. True partnership requires truth, even when that truth might be uncomfortable. Richard had gone from pale to crimson. This is preposterous. A trick. We would have known if our estate had been sold. Would you? When was the last time you reviewed your family's holdings personally, rather than relying on the same financial advisors who watched your portfolio decline by 22% last quarter? I raised an eyebrow as his expression confirmed my accuracy. The sale was structured to allow your family to save face. The lease agreement guaranteed you could maintain residence and appearances, provided certain financial obligations were met. I turned to Mr. Harrington. Financial obligations that have been in default for the past 3 months, if I'm not mistaken. The attorney nodded reluctantly, unable to deny documented facts. There have been cash flow issues with, the Westbrook holdings. Temporary, of course. Of course, I echoed, gathering my things. Well, this has been an enlightening anniversary celebration. Thank you for the clarity it has provided. James stood, panic replacing his shock. Elise, wait. We need to talk about this. I had no idea about any of this. About who you really are, about the estate, about my family's financial situation. That's rather the point, isn't it? I said quietly. 5 years of marriage, and you never really knew me because you never really tried to see beyond what your family told you to see. I slipped my wrap around my shoulders. As for the post-nuptial agreement, I don't think it will be necessary after all. My attorneys will be in touch about more pressing matters, like the defaulted lease on the property you're all so desperate to protect from the woman who actually owns it. Patricia found her voice, though it trembled with uncharacteristic uncertainty. You wouldn't evict us. It would cause a scandal. I paused, considering her words. You know, Patricia, that's exactly the kind of concern that someone from my circumstances wouldn't understand, isn't it? The importance of appearances, the fear of social scandal. I gave her a smile that held no warmth. Fortunately, I've had 5 years of excellent education in the Westbrook family values. With that, I turned and walked away from the table, from the stunned silence, from 5 years of dimming my light, to avoid casting shadows on my husband's family's fragile egos. The maitre d' rushed to open the door for me, whether recognizing my name or simply responding to the newfound authority in my bearing, I couldn't say. Outside, the cool evening air filled my lungs, and for the first time in years I felt like I could breathe fully. My car, a modest sedan I'd chosen to avoid antagonizing the Westbrooks with displays of wealth, waited at the curb, but tonight called for something different. I pulled out my phone and made a call. Margaret, it's me. I need the Bentley brought around. I paused, glancing back at the restaurant where my husband and his family were undoubtedly still reeling. And contact the legal team. It's time to stop playing small. As I ended the call, I felt a strange mixture of grief and liberation washing over me. The marriage I thought I had was gone, perhaps had never truly existed. but in its place stood something more valuable. The truth of who I was, uncompromised and unapologetic. The irony wasn't lost on me. The Westbrooks had spent 5 years fearing I would take what was theirs, never suspecting that what they most valued had been mine, all along. But the true wealth they had failed to recognize wasn't measured in property deeds or investment portfolios. It was the integrity, resilience, and self-worth I had built from nothing. Assets no prenuptial agreement could ever touch. My phone buzzed with a text from James. "Please come back. We need to talk." I had no idea. I stared at the message, recognizing the desperate plea of a man suddenly confronted with the consequences of his choices and his family's prejudices. For a moment, I considered responding, telling him I needed time to think, to process the betrayal of this evening. Instead, I simply switched off my phone and slipped it into my purse. Tonight was not about what James needed. Tonight was about reclaiming the power I had gradually surrendered in my quest to be accepted by a family that had never intended to see me as an equal. The Bentley glided to the curb, its sleek black exterior gleaming under the streetlights. The driver stepped out, nodding respectfully as he opened the door for me. "Where to, Ms. Ellis?" he asked, using the name I hadn't heard spoken aloud in the 5 years since my marriage. I settled into the plush leather seats, feeling the weight of my decision, the finality of the step I was taking. There would be consequences, legal, social, emotional. The carefully constructed narrative of my life with James would unravel publicly, exposing truths I had kept hidden for reasons that now seemed foreign to my nature. But tonight was not the time for those concerns. Tonight was for reclaiming the woman I had been before, the strategist, the visionary, the architect of her own destiny. "Home," I said simply. "The penthouse, please." As the car pulled away from the curb, I caught a glimpse of James rushing out of the restaurant, scanning the street frantically. Our eyes met briefly through the tinted window, his desperate and pleading, mine resolved and clear. Then the Bentley turned the corner, and he vanished from view. The night unfolded before me like a roadmap to a future I was only beginning to envision, one where I no longer contorted myself to fit the diminished space others had allocated for me. The buildings of downtown Boston glittered like stars brought down to earth, reminding me of the empire I had built before I had ever heard the name Westbrook. Tomorrow would bring challenges, meetings with attorneys, decisions about the estate, confrontations with James and his family. I would need to reclaim my public identity as Maxwell Ellis, step back into the business world I had only partially retreated from, face the questions and inevitable gossip about my unusual double life. But tonight belonged to Elise. Not Elise Westbrook, the seemingly fortunate nobody who had married above her station, but Elise Maxwell Ellis, the woman who had built herself from nothing, who owned not just the Westbrook estate, but properties across 3 continents, whose net worth dwarfed that of the family who had dared to call her a gold digger. As the Bentley navigated the familiar streets toward the luxury building that housed my private residence, a penthouse I had maintained but rarely visited during my marriage, I caught my reflection in the window. The woman who gazed back at me seemed different somehow, stronger, more defined, as if layers of careful self-restraint had been peeled away to reveal the authentic self beneath. For 5 years, I had allowed myself to be underestimated, dismissed, and condescended to. I had bitten my tongue when Patricia made cutting remarks about my mysterious background. I had smiled politely when Richard explained basic investment concepts to me that I had mastered before he'd even heard of them. I had nodded understandingly when James gently suggested I defer to his family's experience in matters where I was, in fact, the unacknowledged expert. No more. The Bentley pulled up to my building, and as the doorman rushed to greet me, "Ms. Ellis, it's been too long." I felt the first genuine smile of the evening cross my face. "It's good to be home, Thomas," I replied, meaning it in ways he couldn't possibly understand. The private elevator whisked me to the penthouse level, its silent efficiency a stark contrast to the chaotic emotions of the evening. When the doors opened directly into my foyer, I stepped into a space that reflected who I truly was: elegant but understated, valuable but tasteful, powerful but welcoming. I kicked off my heels, padded across the marble floors to the floor-to-ceiling windows, and gazed out at the city sprawled below. My city, in many ways. Buildings whose mortgages I held, developments I had financed, properties I had transformed from neglected spaces to vibrant communities. My phone, which I had switched back on upon arriving, chimed with messages. James, his parents, my assistant Margaret, even Mr. Harrington, all demanding attention, explanations, decisions. They could wait. Tonight was for me. I picked up the remote control and pressed a button. Across the room, a section of wall slid silently aside, revealing a hidden office, the command center from which I had continued to direct Ellis Investment Group throughout my marriage, during early mornings, before James woke and late nights after he'd gone to bed. The computer screens illuminated automatically as I approached, displaying the current status of my holdings, including the Westbrook estate and its surrounding properties. A series of folders contained documentation of the Westbrook's financial decline over the past decade, information I had gathered but never used, out of respect for the family I had married into. I settled into my chair, fingers hovering over the keyboard as I considered my next move. Not just regarding the Westbrooks and their defaulted lease, but my life moving forward. For years, I had been living a half-existence, concealing my accomplishments, downplaying my intelligence, making myself smaller to fit into the narrow box the Westbrook family had assigned to me. The realization hit me with sudden clarity. I had become the very thing I had fought so hard to escape, a woman defined by others' perceptions rather than her own truth. Well, no more. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of a new chapter, one written entirely in my own hand. I closed the hidden office and returned to the main living area, pouring myself a glass of the Macallan 25 I kept for significant moments. This certainly qualified. As I sipped the amber liquid, savoring its complex warmth, I raised my glass in a silent toast to the woman I had been, the woman I had temporarily lost, and the woman I was reclaiming. Stronger, wiser, and unapologetically authentic. The Westbrooks had called me a gold digger, never suspecting that the true fortune had been within me all along. Now they would discover exactly what that fortune was capable of accomplishing. Not in vengeance, but in justice. Not in cruelty, but in truth. After all, true wealth isn't measured by what you have, but by what you refuse to compromise. And I was no longer willing to compromise myself for the approval of those who had never intended to see my worth. The Bentley pulled away from the curb, leaving James standing on the sidewalk outside Luminescence, his desperate expression fading into the distance. My driver, Michael, maintained a respectful silence as we navigated through Boston's evening traffic, intuitively understanding that I needed this moment of quiet contemplation. As the city lights blurred past my window, my mind raced with the implications of what had just transpired. 5 years of carefully maintaining a facade had crumbled in a single evening. 5 years of diminishing myself to protect the Westbrook family's pride, of playing the role they had assigned me without complaint. Gone, in an instant of clarity that felt both liberating and terrifying. My phone continued to vibrate incessantly in my purse. I knew without looking that it would be filled with messages from James, his parents, their lawyer, all demanding explanations, all suddenly realizing that the woman they had dismissed as a fortune hunter was actually holding all the cards in a game they didn't even know they were playing. "Ms. Ellis," Michael spoke softly, interrupting my thoughts. "Ms. Crawford is calling on the car line. Would you like me to put her through?" Amelia Crawford, my chief financial officer and one of the few people who knew the truth about my dual identity. I had handpicked her from Harvard Business School 8 years ago, recognizing in her the same hunger for success, the same determination to prove herself in a world that underestimated her. "Yes. Thank you, Michael." The car's speaker system crackled to life. "Elise, are you all right?" Amelia's voice filled the car, concern evident in every syllable. "Margaret called me after your dinner request. She said something about the Bentley and contacting legal. What's happened?" I took a deep breath, surprised by the emotions suddenly tightening my throat. "The Westbrooks know, Amelia. Everything." There was a moment of stunned silence before she responded. "Well, damn. How did they take it?" "About as well as you'd expect," I replied, allowing myself a small, humorless laugh. "Patricia looked like she might faint. Richard turned several interesting shades of purple. And James." I trailed off, the image of my husband's shocked face rising unbidden in my mind. The betrayal in his eyes had been real, not because of who I was, but because I had kept it from him. In that moment, I had seen our marriage for what it truly was, a relationship built on partial truths and mutual misconceptions. "And James?" Amelia prompted gently. "James looked like he was seeing me for the first time," I said quietly. "Maybe he was." Amelia sighed, and I could picture her running a hand through her auburn hair, a habit when she was strategizing. "What triggered this? You've kept the Maxwell Ellis identity separate from your marriage for 5 years. Why the sudden revelation?" The question pierced through my emotional turmoil, bringing me back to the cold, hard facts of the evening. They ambushed me with a post-nuptial agreement, at our anniversary dinner no less, called me a gold digger to my face and demanded I sign away any rights to their estate. "The estate that you own," Amelia stated flatly. "The very one." "Jesus, Elise." She paused, and I heard the clicking of a keyboard in the background. "I'm pulling up the Westbrook portfolio now. Their lease has been in default for 3 months. I finished for her." "Yes, I know." Another pause. "So what now? Do you want me to initiate foreclosure proceedings? We have every legal right." The question hung in the air between us. What did I want? Revenge? Justice? Or simply the freedom to finally live authentically without apology? Not yet, I decided. I need to think strategically about this. The Westbrooks aren't just my in-laws. They're connected to half of Boston's elite. Whatever move I make next needs to be calculated, not emotional. "Understood," Amelia replied, professional as always. "I'll have the legal team prepare options for you to review. Where should I send them? The penthouse?" "Yes, I won't be returning to the Westbrook estate tonight. Maybe not ever." The finality of that statement settled heavily in my chest. Despite everything, the estate had been my home for 5 years. I had redesigned its gardens, renovated its dated interiors, breathed new life into the cold, imposing mansion that the Westbrooks prized as the symbol of their status. And now, in the span of an evening, it had reverted from home to asset in my mind. Elise, Amelia's voice softened. For what it's worth, I've never understood why you hid who you are for them. The woman I know, the brilliant strategist, who built Ellis Investment Group from nothing. She doesn't shrink herself for anyone. I gazed out at the familiar streets of Boston, now seeing them with new eyes. Maybe I needed to remember that myself. After ending the call, I leaned back against the leather seat, allowing the gravity of my situation to fully settle over me. I had just detonated my marriage, exposed my carefully guarded secret identity, and set myself on a collision course with one of Boston's most influential families. Yet strangely, I felt more at peace than I had in years. The Bentley pulled up to my building, and I stepped out into the cool night air, nodding my thanks to Michael. The doorman greeted me with genuine warmth. Welcome home, Ms. Ellis. A simple acknowledgement that contrasted sharply with the conditional acceptance I'd grown accustomed to from the Westbrooks. The penthouse felt both foreign and familiar as I moved through its spacious rooms. I'd maintained it throughout my marriage, ostensibly as an office space for Ellis Investment Group, but rarely spent time here. Now, its clean lines and uncluttered surfaces welcomed me like an old friend who had been waiting patiently for my return. I kicked off my heels and padded to the kitchen, pouring myself a generous glass of Macallan 25. The rich amber liquid caught the light as I raised it in a silent toast to my newfound freedom. My phone buzzed yet again. James. This time, I answered. Elise. His voice sounded strained, desperate. Where are you? We need to talk about this. I'm home, James, I replied calmly. My home. Please, he continued, ignoring my pointed distinction. I had no idea about the estate, about who you really are. You have to believe me. I took a slow sip of my scotch, considering my words. Carefully. I believe that you didn't know the estate legally belongs to me, but you knew exactly who I was, James. Or rather, who you and your family decided I was from the moment we met. A social climber, an opportunist, someone who could never possibly be your equal. That's not fair, he protested. I loved you. I still love you for who you are, not what my parents think. Do you? I challenged, my voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. Then why did you allow them to ambush me tonight? Why did you sit there silently while they called me a gold digger to my face and demanded I sign away rights to property that, ironically, already belongs to me? His hesitation spoke volumes. They're my family, Elise. I was trying to find a middle ground. There is no middle ground when it comes to respect, James. It either exists in a relationship or it doesn't. I moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the city lights. And it's become painfully clear that it doesn't. Not from your parents, and not, when it truly mattered, from you. That's not true, he insisted, his voice cracking. I respected you enough to want to build a life with you, to make you my wife? Your wife, I interrupted. Not your partner, not your equal. There's a difference. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken truths and shattered illusions. What happens now? He finally asked, his voice small. With us? With the estate? I don't know, I answered honestly. But whatever happens, it will be on my terms, not your family's. After ending the call, I moved to my home office, activating the hidden panel that concealed my private workspace. The computer screens illuminated automatically, bathing the room in a soft blue glow as I settled into my chair. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the Westbrook portfolio. Not just the estate, but the entire financial history of the family I had married into. The picture it painted was more concerning than I had allowed myself to acknowledge over the years. Westbrook Holdings was hemorrhaging money across multiple divisions. Their traditional investments in shipping and real estate had faltered as they failed to adapt to changing markets. Their refusal to embrace new technologies or diversify their holdings had left them vulnerable in a rapidly evolving economy. The estate itself was merely the most visible symbol of a dynasty in decline, a fact the Westbrooks had gone to great lengths to conceal from Boston society and, apparently, from their own son. I pulled up the original purchase agreement from 8 years ago, long before I'd met James. The Westbrook family had been quietly desperate then, facing bankruptcy after a series of poor investments. My acquisition of their estate, structured as a long-term lease that allowed them to maintain the appearance of ownership, had actually saved them from financial ruin and public humiliation. The irony was almost painful. The very family that had looked down on me as a fortune hunter had themselves been secretly dependent on my fortune all along. A soft ping alerted me to an incoming email from Amelia, containing the legal options she had promised. I skimmed the document, considering my next move carefully. I could foreclose on the defaulted lease immediately, forcing the Westbrooks out of their ancestral home with brutal efficiency. I could demand full public acknowledgement of the true ownership, embarrassing them in the social circles they so desperately wanted to impress. But as I thought about these options, a different path began to take shape in my mind, one that would require more finesse, but might ultimately prove more satisfying. The Westbrooks had spent years underestimating me, dismissing my worth, and questioning my motives. Perhaps it was time to show them exactly who they had been dealing with all along, not through vengeance, but through vision. Not through retribution, but through reimagination of what the Westbrook legacy could become under the guidance of the woman they had so callously misjudged. I closed the legal document and opened a blank file, beginning to sketch out a new proposal. One that would transform not just the estate, but the entire Westbrook Holdings business model. By the time the first rays of dawn began to illuminate the Boston skyline, I had outlined a comprehensive restructuring plan that could save the failing company, modernize its operations, and secure its future. But more importantly, I had rediscovered my own voice, the confident, strategic mind that had built an empire from nothing, the woman who had never needed anyone's validation to recognize her own worth. As I finally closed my laptop and prepared for a few hours of rest, my phone chimed with a text message from Patricia Westbrook. "We need to discuss terms. Lunch at the estate 1 p.m. I smiled at the presumption, the assumption that she would be dictating terms, that the estate was still her domain to command. Even now, facing the collapse of her family's carefully constructed facade, Patricia couldn't conceive of a world where she wasn't in control. "The penthouse noon," I replied simply. "Bring James and Richard, and don't bother with lawyers. This discussion will be between family." I set the phone aside and moved to the bedroom, shedding the burgundy dress that now seemed to belong to another woman. Elise Westbrook, the compliant wife who had allowed herself to be diminished for the eye. Comfort of others. As I slipped into silk pajamas and slid between the crisp sheets of a bed that had waited empty for 5 years, I felt myself reconnecting with the woman I had always been beneath the surface. Elise Maxwell Ellis, who built rather than borrowed, who created rather than clung, who had always been the architect of her own destiny. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, negotiation, and perhaps the final dissolution of my marriage. But it would also bring the opportunity to reclaim my authentic self, to step fully into the power I had voluntarily set aside in the name of love and acceptance. As I drifted toward sleep, I realized that the Westbrooks had inadvertently given me the most valuable anniversary gift possible: the freedom to stop pretending to be less than I was. The freedom to stop apologizing for my success, my intelligence, my worth. The freedom to simply be. Morning arrived with the soft chime of my alarm, pulling me from a surprisingly restful sleep. For a moment, disorientation clouded my mind as I registered the unfamiliar surroundings of my penthouse bedroom, so different from the ornate master suite of the Westbrook estate. Then the events of the previous evening came rushing back, and with them, a renewed sense of purpose. I moved through my morning routine with deliberate efficiency, selecting a tailored charcoal suit that I hadn't worn since my last major acquisition, meeting 3 years ago. The woman who gazed back at me from the mirror looked different somehow, more defined, more present, as if a veil had been lifted from her features. A text from Margaret informed me that all preparations for the noon meeting were underway. The penthouse dining room was being set up, catering arranged, and security notified of the expected visitors. She had also taken the liberty of having fresh clothes and necessities delivered, anticipating that I might not be returning to the estate to collect my belongings. Such thoughtfulness reminded me of why I had built a team rather than an empire, of one. Even in my self-imposed isolation as James's wife, I had maintained connections to people who valued me for my mind, my vision, my leadership, not just for the role I played in someone else's narrative. At precisely noon, the private elevator announced the arrival of my guests. I stood in the center of the living room, perfectly still, watching as the doors opened to reveal the Westbrook family. Patricia entered first, her usual elegant composure visibly strained. Her eyes darted around the penthouse, taking in the understated luxury of the space I had designed myself, so different from the ostentatious opulence of their ancestral home. Richard followed, his expression a carefully neutral mask that failed to conceal his discomfort at finding himself in the position of supplicant rather than benefactor. James came last, his gaze finding mine immediately. The man who had slept beside me for 5 years looked like a stranger now, uncertain, almost afraid, as if seeing me for the first time, and unsure of what he was seeing. "Elise," Patricia began, her voice fighting for its usual authoritative, "Deny, this dramatic display is hardly necessary. Family matters should be discussed at home." "We are discussing them at my home," I replied calmly. "Please sit down. Lunch will be served shortly." I gestured toward the dining room, where the table had been set for 4. The Westbrooks exchanged glances, clearly thrown off balance by my serene command of the situation. After a moment's hesitation, they moved toward the indicated seats. "I must say this is all quite theatrical," Richard commented, attempting to regain some measure of control through dismissiveness. "If you had simply been honest about your financial situation from the beginning, would it have made a difference?" I interrupted, taking my seat at the head of the table. "Would you have welcomed me more warmly if you'd known my net worth exceeded yours by a factor of 10? or would you have simply found other reasons to consider me unworthy of your son? The question hung in the air, uncomfortable in its directness. It was Patricia who finally answered, her voice tight. We have certain expectations for our family. Certain traditions. Certain values. Like honesty? I suggested. The value you demonstrated so admirably last night, ambushing me with lawyers, at my anniversary dinner? James shifted in his seat. Elise, please. We're here to find a solution, not trade accusations. I regarded him thoughtfully. You're right, James. Solutions are precisely what we need to discuss. As the first course was served by the discreet catering staff, I opened a leather portfolio and extracted 3 identical document folders, passing one to each of the Westbrooks. What's this? Richard demanded, not opening his folder. The key? Future of Westbrook Holdings, I replied simply, or at least one possible future. Patricia cautiously opened her folder, her eyes widening as she scanned the contents. This is a restructuring proposal? For our company? For our company, I corrected her gently. As you now know, I've been a significant silent investor in Westbrook Holdings for years, well beyond my ownership of the estate. What you may not realize is just how precarious your financial situation has become. Richard's face flushed. Our financial matters are none of your... They became my concern the moment your family's poor management began threatening investments I made in good faith, I interrupted, my voice remaining calm but firm. Westbrook Holdings is 3/4 away from insolvency, Richard. Your shipping division is operating at a 40% loss. Your commercial real estate holdings have been devalued by nearly 30% due to neglected maintenance and failure to adapt to changing market demands. The color drained from his face as quickly as it had appeared. That's impossible. Our financial advisors would have... Your financial advisors have been presenting creatively optimistic projections to avoid delivering bad news to a family known for shooting the messenger, I stated, taking a sip of water. A fact I could have told you years ago, had anyone bothered to ask for my professional opinion. James was staring at me as if seeing a stranger. You knew all this? About my family's company? All these years? I've maintained a careful distance from Westbrook business matters out of respect for your family's pride, I explained, meeting his gaze directly. A courtesy that was clearly not reciprocated when it came to my privacy and dignity. Patricia had continued reading through the proposal, her expression shifting from indignation to reluctant interest. This restructuring plan, it's quite thorough. I spent most of last night developing it, I acknowledged. It addresses the core weaknesses in your current business model while preserving the Westbrook name and legacy. Something I assume is still important to you. And what do you get out of this? Richard asked suspiciously. I smiled slightly. A return on my investment, both financial and personal. The satisfaction of transforming a failing company into something sustainable. And perhaps most importantly, the opportunity to finally step fully into my own identity, without apology or concealment. James looked up from the proposal he had been examining. This would require our family to publicly acknowledge your role as majority owner. Yes, I confirmed. No more shadows. No more pretending to be less than I am to make others comfortable with their own limitations. The Westbrooks exchanged glances, a silent family communication I had witnessed countless times but never been part of. It was Patricia who finally spoke, her voice carrying the weight of grudging respect. You could simply foreclose on the estate. Force us out. Take control of the company through legal means, given our financial situation. She studied me with new eyes. Why offer this alternative? I considered the question carefully, aware that my answer would shape whatever came. Next, because destroying what you've built would be easy, but ultimately unsatisfying, I said honestly. I didn't become successful by tearing things down, but by recognizing potential where others see only problems. Westbrook Holdings has potential, despite its current mismanagement. And perhaps... I hesitated, then continued. Perhaps the Westbrook family does as well. A heavy silence fell over the table, broken only by the soft sound of cutlery against fine china as the main course was served. The Westbrooks were being forced to reevaluate everything they thought they knew, about their company, about their future, and most discomfitingly, about the woman they had dismissed as a fortune hunter who had instead been their financial savior, all along. "We'll need time to consider this proposal," Richard finally said, his usual bluster notably absent. "Of course," I agreed. "Take 48 hours. But understand that this offer expires after that. The alternative is that Ellis Investment Group exercises its legal rights regarding both the estate and its holdings in Westbrook companies." As lunch concluded and the Westbrooks prepared to leave, James lingered behind. "Elise," he said quietly, "what about us? Where does this business proposal leave our marriage?" I regarded the man I had loved, the man I had diminished myself for, with a mixture of lingering affection and clear-eyed assessment. "That depends," I replied honestly, "on whether you're finally ready to see me, the real me, as your equal partner, not just your wife. On whether the man I married exists independent of his family's expectations and prejudices." He reached for my hand, and for the first time since our wedding day, I saw uncertainty in his eyes. Not about his feelings for me, but about who he was apart from the Westbrook name and legacy. "I don't know who I am without them," he admitted, the confession clearly painful. "But I'd like the chance to find out. With you, if you'll give me that opportunity." I didn't pull my hand away, but neither did I offer false reassurance. Start? By deciding who James Westbrook is when he's not being Richard and Patricia's son. When you know the answer to that, we can discuss who we might be together. As the elevator doors closed behind him, I returned to the window, gazing out at the city that had watched me transform from a determined young woman with nothing but ambition into Maxwell Ellis, financial prodigy, and then into Elise Westbrook, the seemingly fortunate nobody who had married into old money. Now it was time for the world to meet the woman who was both of these identities and yet something more. Someone who no longer needed to choose between personal fulfillment and professional power, between being loved and being respected. The Westbrooks had called me a gold digger, never suspecting that I was actually the gold mine. The irony might have been amusing if it hadn't revealed so much about the fragility of a world built on appearances rather than substance. But as I turned back to my desk, preparing for the afternoon of meetings that would reintroduce Maxwell Ellis to the business world after 5 years of relative seclusion, I felt no desire for retribution. The greatest revenge against those who had underestimated me wouldn't come from their humiliation, but from their education, from forcing them to expand their understanding of worth beyond the narrow confines of family names and social pedigrees. After all, true wealth isn't measured by what you inherit, but by what you build. And I had been building my entire life. Not just a financial empire, but the inner resources to withstand precisely this kind of reckoning. Some might call it karma, that the family so concerned with protecting their assets from me would discover those assets had been mine all along. But I preferred to see it as an opportunity, a chance to transform not just Westbrook Holdings, but perhaps the Westbrooks themselves. Ambitious? Perhaps. But then, I had always set my sights on goals others considered impossible, and I had yet to fail. At precisely noon, the private elevator announced the arrival of my expected guests. I stood in the center of my living room, wearing a tailored navy suit that projected the quiet confidence I had suppressed for far too long. The doors slid open to reveal the Westbrook family, Patricia and Richard looking tense but composed, James following behind them with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Welcome," I said simply, gesturing toward the dining room where a professional lunch had been arranged. Patricia took in the penthouse with poorly concealed surprise. The space was nothing like the ornate, traditional decor of their family estate. My design aesthetic favored clean lines, natural materials, and carefully curated modern art, subtle wealth rather than ostentatious display. "This is quite different from what I expected," she commented, her voice strained with the effort of politeness. "What did you expect, Patricia?" I asked, not unkindly. "Gaudy nouveau riche extravagance to confirm your assumptions about me." Richard cleared his throat uncomfortably. "We're here to discuss business, not interior design preferences." "Indeed we are," I agreed, directing them to their seats. As we settled around the dining table, I could feel the weight of 5 years of misunderstanding pressing down on us all. The Westbrooks had arrived expecting to negotiate from a position of social superiority, to offer me some face-saving compromise that would protect their pride while securing their interests. They had yet to fully grasp the fundamental shift in our power dynamic. "I've prepared a comprehensive proposal," I began, distributing leather-bound portfolios to each of them. "But before we discuss specifics, I think we need to address the elephant in the room." "And what would that be?" Richard asked stiffly. I met his gaze directly. "The fact that Westbrook Holdings is 3 months away from insolvency." The color drained from Richard's face while Patricia's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. James looked between his parents, confusion evident in his expression. "What is she talking about?" he asked them. "Dad, is that true?" Richard's jaw tightened. "Business fluctuations are normal. We're experiencing a temporary cash flow issue that has resulted in defaulted lease payments on your estate, maxed out credit facilities, and imminent breach of loan covenants with your primary lenders," I finished for him. "This isn't a fluctuation, Richard. It's a systemic failure of your business model." James stared at his father in disbelief. "You told me the company was thriving, that we were expanding into new markets." "We are," Richard insisted. "These challenges are merely—" "Perhaps we should all review the proposal," I suggested gently, saving Richard from the humiliation of continued denials. "I believe it offers a path forward that addresses these challenges while preserving what matters most to all of you." The next 30 minutes passed in silence as the Westbrooks read through my restructuring plan. I had spent the early hours of morning crafting a strategy that would modernize Westbrook Holdings, diversify its revenue streams, and leverage its historical brand equity in more sustainable ways. The plan was meticulous, innovative, and, most importantly, salvageable despite the company's dire financial situation. Patricia was the first to look up, her expression a complex mixture of resentment and reluctant admiration. "This is surprisingly thoughtful." "Why surprising?" I asked mildly. Because gold diggers aren't known for their business acumen? She had the grace to flush. Elise, you must understand how your secrecy appeared to us. You entered our son's life with no apparent background, no family connections. No family connections, I repeated softly. Yes, that was the unforgivable sin, wasn't it? Not my character or my compatibility with your son, but my lack of the right pedigree. Richard interjected, tapping the proposal with one finger. This plan would require significant capital investment, capital we clearly don't have, or we wouldn't be in this position. I'm aware, I replied. Ellis Investment Group is prepared to provide that capital in exchange for formal recognition of my position as majority stakeholder and appointment as CEO of the restructured Westbrook Holdings. The room fell silent. James was staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. You'd save the company? He asked finally. After everything that happened last night, after the way my family treated you for years, you'd still save Westbrook Holdings. I considered my answer carefully. I'm not doing this out of generosity or forgiveness, James. I'm doing it because I see potential value where others see only failure. That's how I built my fortune, by recognizing opportunities others missed and having the courage to pursue them. Patricia's perfect posture had begun to slump slightly, the weight of their situation finally settling on her shoulders. And if we refuse? Then Ellis Investment Group will exercise its legal rights regarding the defaulted lease on the estate and its existing minority positions in Westbrook subsidiaries, I stated matter-of-factly. The company will likely enter bankruptcy within the quarter. The estate will be sold, and the Westbrook family will face the very public reckoning it has been desperately trying to avoid. It wasn't a threat, merely a statement of the inevitable consequences of their financial reality. The three Westbrooks exchanged glances, a silent family communication I had witnessed countless times but never been part of. We need time to consider this, Richard said finally. Of course. You have 48 hours. I stood, signaling the end of our lunch meeting. My legal team will be available to answer any questions about the proposal's details. As they prepared to leave, James lingered behind, waiting until his parents had entered the elevator before speaking. May I stay? He asked quietly. I think we need to talk. Really talk. About everything. I studied him for a moment. Despite the anger and hurt still simmering beneath my composed exterior, I couldn't deny the genuine confusion and pain in his eyes. He had been caught between worlds, the son who wanted to please his parents, the husband who had failed to truly see his wife. All right, I agreed, gesturing toward the sitting area with its panoramic view of Boston Harbor. We sat in awkward silence for several moments, 5 years of marriage suddenly insufficient preparation for honest conversation. Why didn't you tell me? He asked finally. About who you really were? About your company? About owning the estate? I gazed out at the harbor, gathering my thoughts. At first, it was because I wanted to be loved for myself, not my money. I'd been pursued for my wealth before, men who saw me as a convenient shortcut to success. When I met you, I wanted something real. And later? He prompted. Later. I sighed. Later, it became clear how much your identity was wrapped up in being the provider, in fulfilling the role your family expected. You took such pride in supporting us, in being the heir to the Westbrook legacy. I didn't want to take that from you. So you diminished yourself instead? It wasn't a question. James ran a hand through his hair, looking genuinely distressed. Do you know how that makes me feel? To realize my wife felt she had to hide her brilliance, her success, because my ego couldn't handle it? The honest self-reflection surprised me. It wasn't a conscious decision, James. It happened gradually. Accommodations I made to fit into your world, to be accepted by your family. By the time I realized how much of myself I'd compromised, it seemed too late to change the narrative. And now? He asked softly. Now everything has changed, I replied. I can't go back to being the woman who makes herself small for others' comfort. I won't. James nodded slowly. I wouldn't want you to. He hesitated, then added, The woman I saw in that meeting today, confident, strategic, unapologetically brilliant, that's who I want to know. Who I should have been allowed to know all along. I studied him, searching for signs of the condescension or resentment I might have expected. Instead, I found what appeared to be genuine admiration and regret. It's not that simple, James. Your family's treatment of me, your silence last night when they called me a gold digger to my face, those wounds don't heal overnight. I know, he acknowledged. And I'm not asking for immediate forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to understand the woman I married. The real woman, not the version who edited herself to protect my pride. For the first time since the disastrous anniversary dinner, I felt a small crack in the wall of hurt and anger I'd built around my heart. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the possibility of a new understanding. That would require you to define yourself outside your family's expectations, I said carefully. To question the values and assumptions you've been raised with. Are you prepared to do that? He didn't answer immediately, which I respected more than a hasty promise would have been. Finally, he said, I don't know, but I want to try. Not just for us, but for myself. Last night showed me how little I really know about the business I was set to inherit, about the financial realities my parents have been hiding. If I've been that blind about my family's company, what else have I failed to see clearly? It was a start. An acknowledgement of the need for growth rather than a declaration that growth had already happened. In my experience building companies and investing in potential, that honest recognition of the work ahead was worth more than premature promises of transformation. I can't make any guarantees about our marriage, I said honestly, but I'm willing to get to know the James who thinks for himself, who makes his own decisions based on his own values, if that man exists. He nodded, accepting the conditional nature of my response. He does, or at least he's fighting to emerge. James stood, preparing to leave. Thank you for the proposal, Elise. Whatever my parents decide, I want you to know I recognize the generosity in offering a path forward rather than simply exercising your legal rights. It's the most meaningful, James countered, and the one where I can learn the most about real development rather than just property management. I studied him thoughtfully, trying to reconcile this suddenly purposeful man with the passive husband who had sat silently while his family ambushed me with lawyers. Was this genuine growth, or merely a tactical adjustment to our new power dynamic? You've never expressed interest in affordable housing initiatives before, I noted, keeping my tone neutral. James met my gaze directly. I've never been asked what actually interests me before. It was always assumed I would simply follow the established path. He hesitated, then added, The community development concept in your proposal. It reminded me of the volunteer work I did in college, before I was pulled into the family business. It was the last time I felt like I was doing something meaningful, rather than just fulfilling expectations. The revelation surprised me. In 5 years of marriage, James had never mentioned this aspect of his past. Had I been so focused on navigating my place in his world that I'd failed to truly know the man I'd married? Or had he buried these parts of himself so deeply that they were inaccessible even to him until now? I accept your conditions regarding the public narrative and board positions, I said to Richard and Patricia, my decision made. And I'm willing to consider James for the Community Development Division, contingent on his commitment to proper training and professional development in that sector. The relief on the elder Westbrook's faces was palpable. They had maintained their social facade, even if the substance beneath it had fundamentally changed. Then we have an agreement, Richard said, extending his hand in a gesture that must have cost him considerable pride. I accepted the handshake, sealing the arrangement that would transform both Westbrook Holdings and my own public identity. I'll have the legal team prepare the final documents. We'll announce the restructuring next week. As the meeting concluded, and Richard and Patricia withdrew to digest the new reality of their circumstances, James remained behind. Thank you, he said simply, not just for saving the company, but for giving me a chance to prove myself, to become something more than just a Westbrook heir. I regarded him thoughtfully. Is that why you stayed? To secure your position in the restructured company? No, he replied, surprising me with his directness. I stayed because I want a chance to know the woman who could have destroyed us, but chose to rebuild instead. The woman who saw potential where others, including me, saw only tradition. He paused, then added, the woman I married but never truly knew. In that moment, standing in the library where his family had plotted to legally classify me as a gold digger just 24 hours earlier, I realized that the greatest transformation might not be Westbrook Holdings, or even my own public emergence, as Maxwell Ellis. It might be the possibility that James Westbrook, freed from the suffocating expectations of family legacy, could become a partner worthy of the woman I had always been beneath the accommodating facade. The true test would not be found in legal documents or corporate restructuring, but in the days and months ahead, in whether James could truly embrace the woman who had outshined his family's legacy, and whether I could forgive the man who had allowed me to dim my light for far too long. We'll see, I said simply, neither promising reconciliation nor closing the door to its possibility. We have a company to rebuild first. As I left the estate that evening, the magnificent structure silhouetted against the twilight sky, I felt strangely unburdened. For the first time in 5 years, I wasn't returning home as someone playing a role in someone else's narrative. I was Elise Maxwell Ellis, investor, strategist, builder, stepping fully into my power without apology or constraint. The gold digger they had feared had turned out to be the gold mine they desperately needed. The irony wasn't lost on me, but neither was the profound lesson embedded in this reversal of fortune. Your true worth never depends on others' recognition of it. It exists independently of their perception, waiting patiently for the moment when you're finally ready to claim it without compromise. That moment, for me, had finally arrived. I thought I might find you here. The voice startled me from my reflections. I looked up to see Amelia approaching, 2 takeout coffee cups in hand. How did you know? I asked, accepting the offered coffee. She smiled, settling beside me on the bench. You always retreated to parks when faced with major decisions, even back when we were just starting Ellis Investment Group. Some habits don't change, even when everything else does. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping our coffee and watching the play of light on water. "James came to see me today," I said finally. "Business or personal?" Amelia asked, always direct. "Both, I think. He presented a proposal to transform the Westbrook estate into a center for women entrepreneurs." Amelia's eyebrows shot up. "Well, that's unexpected." "Isn't it?" I agreed, still processing my own reaction to James's transformation. He's been fundraising independently, developing partnerships, creating a vision that directly challenges his family's most sacred traditions. "And what do you think?" she asked carefully, studying my expression. I considered the question, allowing myself to fully explore my complex emotions. "I think I'm seeing a side of James I never knew existed, or perhaps one that didn't exist until now. He seems to be genuinely rethinking his values, his purpose, his identity outside of the Westbrook legacy. And personally," Amelia pressed gently, "are you reconsidering your relationship as well?" The question brought me back to the fundamental dilemma I had been avoiding. Was genuine change possible after 5 years of a relationship built on incomplete truths? Could James truly become a partner worthy of the woman I was now free to be? Most importantly, could I trust this transformation to be lasting rather than merely a reaction to dramatically altered circumstances? "I don't know," I admitted. Part of me wonders if this is simply James adapting to a new power dynamic, finding a role for himself now that the traditional Westbrook path has been disrupted. "And the other part?" Amelia prompted. I sighed, watching a falling leaf drift onto the pond's surface. "The other part remembers why I fell in love with him in the first place. His capacity for kindness, his fundamental decency beneath the privilege and social conditioning. Those qualities are still there, perhaps finding stronger expression, now that he's breaking free from his family's expectations." Amelia nodded thoughtfully. "You know, when you first told me you were dating James Westbrook, I thought you were making a terrible mistake. I couldn't understand how someone as brilliant and independent as you could be attracted to someone so conventional." "He wasn't always conventional," I found myself defending him. "Before his family's influence fully took hold, he had dreams of his own, community service work, environmental initiatives, glimpses of the man he might have become in different circumstances." "And now?" Amelia asked. "Is he becoming that man after all?" The question lingered between us, unanswerable yet vitally important. Was James's transformation genuine and sustainable, or merely a strategic adaptation to change circumstances? And even if it was genuine, was it enough to overcome the years of inequality in our relationship? "Time will tell," I said finally, "but I'm willing to observe with an open mind." As we walked back toward the office, Amelia touched my arm lightly. "Just remember, Elise, you don't owe him or his family anything. Not forgiveness, not partnership, not even professional courtesy beyond what's contractually required. You've given them a second chance their actions didn't deserve. Whatever comes next should be your choice, based on what truly serves your happiness and fulfillment." Her words stayed with me as I returned to my penthouse that evening. The space that had once felt like a retreat from my marriage now seemed like a symbol of authentic selfhood, a place where I had never needed to diminish or disguise who I truly was. I poured myself a glass of wine and settled onto the balcony, watching as twilight transformed Boston's skyline into a glittering tapestry of lights. My phone chimed with an incoming message from James. The site visit to the warehouse district is scheduled for Tuesday at 10 a.m. I've arranged for the community advisors to join us if that meets with your approval. The professional courtesy of the message was a far cry from the entitled assumptions that had characterized much of our marriage. No presumption that I would automatically accommodate his schedule, no expectation that I would follow his lead in meetings. Just a straightforward request for my input on a shared professional goal. I typed a brief reply confirming the arrangement, then set my phone aside to focus on the city spread before me. Somewhere out there, Patricia and Richard Westbrook were adjusting to their new reality, still residing in the estate that had been the source of so much family pride. But now, as tenants rather than owners, their social position maintained through careful public relations rather than actual power. And James was. Where, exactly? I realized I didn't know where he was staying since our separation. Not at the estate with his parents, according to the security logs I still monitored. Not with friends from his social circle, based on the absence of gossip in the society columns that would inevitably have resulted. Perhaps he truly was forging an independent path, one that didn't rely on family connections or inherited privilege. The thought was both surprising and oddly compelling. The next morning brought a new flurry of activity as Ellis Investment Group began implementing the first phase of the Westbrook Holdings restructuring. I found myself energized in a way I hadn't been for years, fully engaging my strategic mind without self-constraint or concealment. The initial market response has exceeded projections, my CFO reported during our morning briefing. Stock value has increased 12% since the announcement, and investor confidence continues to grow. The commercial real estate division reports 5 new leasing agreements finalized this week, another executive added. Apparently, the Westbrook-Ellis partnership has created renewed interest in properties that had been sitting vacant for months. The meeting continued with similarly positive updates across divisions, painting a picture of a company beginning to reverse its downward trajectory through fresh leadership and innovative approaches. And what about the Community Development Initiative? I asked, directing my question to the division head who had been working closely with James. The woman's expression shifted to one of genuine enthusiasm. Mr. Westbrook has been surprisingly effective. He's secured commitments from 3 additional nonprofit partners and developed a comprehensive community engagement strategy that's already generating positive feedback from neighborhood associations. Surprisingly effective, I repeated with a small smile. I sense some initial skepticism in that assessment. The executive nodded candidly. I'll admit I had reservations when you appointed him to lead the division. His background didn't suggest particular expertise or passion in community development. And now? I prompted. Now I'd say he's demonstrating both, she acknowledged. He's been putting in 14-hour days, meeting with community leaders, researching successful models from other cities, and personally walking every property in the development portfolio. Whatever motivated this career change, he's approaching it with remarkable dedication. The report should have been merely professionally satisfying, evidence that my business decision to give James a chance in the restructured company had been sound. Instead, I found myself experiencing a more personal sense of pride in his transformation, a feeling I quickly tried to compartmentalize as the meeting moved on to other topics. Later that afternoon, as I was reviewing architectural proposals for the renovation of Westbrook Holdings headquarters, My assistant announced an unexpected visitor, Catherine Reynolds, a prominent Boston philanthropist whose foundation supported educational initiatives for underserved communities. "Catherine," I greeted her, rising from my desk with genuine pleasure. "This is an unexpected delight." The elegant woman in her 60s embraced me warmly. "Elise, or should I say Maxwell, I simply had to come see you in person. After all, these years of supporting your anonymous donations to our scholarship programs, to discover you've been hiding in plain sight as Elise Westbrook." She laughed softly. "You've given Boston society the most delicious scandal in decades." I smiled, gesturing for her to take a seat. Catherine had been one of the few people who had known about my philanthropic activities, though she had never been aware of my full identity as Maxwell Ellis. "I appreciate your discretion all these years," I said. "It made it possible for me to support causes I believed in without compromising my privacy." Catherine waved a dismissive hand. "Your generosity spoke for itself, regardless of the name attached to it." Her expression grew more serious. "But that's not the only reason I'm here." "Oh?" I prompted, curious about her sudden shift in tone. "I had the most interesting meeting yesterday," she continued, studying me carefully. "With your husband. Or is it estranged husband now? The gossip columns haven't quite determined your current status." "James came to see you?" I asked, surprised. She nodded. "About his proposal for transforming the Westbrook estate into an innovation center for women entrepreneurs. He was quite passionate about it, spoke of creating pathways for brilliant women who lack the resources or connections to realize their potential." Her eyes twinkled with amusement. I couldn't help but wonder where he might have gotten such an idea. "It was entirely his initiative," I said truthfully. "I was as surprised as you are." Catherine studied me thoughtfully. "You know, I've known James Westbrook since he was a boy. Watched him grow up under Richard and Patricia's careful molding into the perfect heir to the Westbrook legacy. Properly educated, impeccably mannered, and utterly conventional in his thinking." "And now?" I asked, genuinely curious about her perception. "Now I see a man who appears to be awakening to a larger world beyond the narrow confines of his upbringing," she replied. "He spoke with such conviction about systemic barriers facing women in business, about privilege and responsibility, about using inherited advantages to create opportunity rather than simply perpetuating inequality." She smiled slightly. "He reminded me very much of you, in fact, the private you I've glimpsed in our conversations about the scholarship program over the years." Her observation caused an unexpected tightness in my chest. Had James been paying closer attention during our marriage than I had realized? Had he absorbed my values and perspectives even as I believed he was merely tolerating them as my personal eccentricities? "My foundation is prepared to offer substantial matching funds for the Innovation Center," Catherine continued, bringing the conversation back to practical matters. "Assuming you approve the project, of course." James was very clear that the ultimate decision rests with you, as the actual owner of the property. The formal acknowledgement of my ownership, coming from James to a third party, represented yet another shift in our relationship dynamic. No attempt to claim shared decision rights based on marital status, no presumption of influence based on family history with the property. "The project has considerable merit," I acknowledged. "I'm still evaluating how it fits within our broader restructuring strategy." Catherine rose to leave, but paused before departing. "You know, Elise, in all my years observing Boston society, I've seen countless marriages of convenience, tradition, and mutual social advantage. What I've rarely witnessed is genuine transformation within those marriages. One partner truly seeing the other with new eyes and growing in response to that recognition. She placed a gentle hand on my arm. Whatever you decide about the innovation, center, or about your marriage, know that real change is indeed possible, though admittedly rare. The question is whether that change, however genuine, is sufficient to create the partnership you truly deserve. After Catherine left, I found myself reflecting on her parting wisdom. Was James's transformation genuine? All evidence suggested it was. Was it sufficient to overcome the fundamental imbalance that had characterized our marriage? That question remained unanswered. My phone chimed with a message from James. Community advisors suggest adding a healthcare component to the warehouse district development. Would like your thoughts before proceeding. Available for dinner to discuss, or can provide written proposal, if you prefer. The careful respect for my boundaries, offering options rather than assuming my availability, stood in stark contrast to our previous patterns of interaction. I found myself texting back, dinner would be fine, 7 p.m. at Lucienne. I'll make the reservation. As I sent the message, I realized I was approaching a crossroads not just professionally, but personally. The woman who had hidden her light for the comfort of others was gone forever. The question now was whether the man who had benefited from that self-diminishment could truly become a partner worthy of the woman I had always been beneath the accommodating facade. The answer, I suspected, wouldn't be found in grand gestures or business proposals, but in the accumulation of daily choices, consistent respect, and genuine appreciation for the uncompromised brilliance I was finally allowing myself to fully embody. Whatever happened between James and me, one thing was certain. I would never again make myself smaller to accommodate someone else's limitations. The gold digger they had feared had turned out to be the gold mine they desperately needed. The irony wasn't lost on me, but neither was the profound liberation that came with finally being recognized for my true worth. As I prepared for the evening ahead, I reminded myself that my value had never depended on their recognition of it. It had existed independently of their perception, patiently waiting for the moment when I was finally ready to claim it without compromise. That moment had arrived, and with it, the freedom to choose a future based not on others' expectations, but on my own authentic truth, whatever that might ultimately entail. 6 months after the revelation that transformed both Westbrook Holdings and my personal identity, I stood on the grounds of what had once been the Westbrook family estate. The sprawling Georgian mansion that had symbolized old money and entrenched privilege was now surrounded by scaffolding and construction equipment, its transformation into the Ellis Westbrook Center for Women's Innovation well underway. The D.I. East Wing renovations are ahead of schedule, James explained as we walked the perimeter, reviewing the construction progress. The educational facilities should be ready for the first cohort of entrepreneurs by next quarter. I nodded approvingly, taking in the visible manifestations of our shared vision. What had once been formal gardens designed to impress society visitors were being reimagined as collaborative outdoor workspaces and sustainable community gardens. The imposing facade that had kept neighbors at a respectful distance was now opening, up with expansive glass entrances designed to welcome rather than intimidate. The community response has been remarkable, I observed, noting the local art students painting a mural on the temporary construction wall. I never imagined this property could generate such genuine enthusiasm. James smiled. the expression of authentic pride rather than the polished social mask he'd worn throughout our early marriage. People recognize authentic transformation when they see it. This isn't just a rebranding of Westbrook privilege, it's a fundamental reimagining of what wealth and influence can accomplish when directed toward opportunity creation rather than opportunity hoarding. His eloquent assessment caught me slightly off guard, though I'd grown accustomed to these moments of insight from him over the past months. The James Westbrook who had once parroted his family's conservative views without question had evolved into someone capable of profound critical thinking about systems of power and privilege, including those that had benefited him throughout his life. "Your parents are adjusting to their new accommodations?" I asked as we approached the carriage house that had been renovated into a comfortable residence for Richard and Patricia. James chuckled softly. "Mother has stopped referring to it as temporary quarters, which I consider significant progress. Father actually mentioned that he appreciates the reduced maintenance responsibilities." His expression grew more serious. "They're adapting, each in their own way. The transition has been hardest on their sense of identity, not their physical comfort." I nodded, understanding the distinction. The elder Westbrooks had lost something more significant than square footage in the transformation of their ancestral home. They had lost the concrete manifestation of their family mythology, the physical embodiment of their perceived superiority. "And what about you?" I asked, studying him thoughtfully. "Do you miss the grandeur of the main house? The family history it represented?" James considered the question carefully before answering, his thoughtfulness another marker of his evolution. The man I'd married would have produced an immediate socially appropriate response. This James took time to examine his authentic feelings before expressing them. "I miss certain memories," he admitted finally. "Holiday gatherings in the formal dining room, reading in the library on rainy afternoons. But those memories remain, regardless of the building's function." He gestured toward the construction activity surrounding us. "What we're creating here honors the best aspects of my family's legacy, the commitment to building something lasting, while discarding the elements that no longer serve a meaningful purpose in today's world." As we completed our tour and headed toward the waiting car, my phone buzzed with a message from Amelia. Financial Times interview confirmed for 2 p.m. They're particularly interested in discussing the Innovation Center's impact on traditional philanthropic models. The past 6 months had brought a whirlwind of media attention, not just to the restructured Westbrook holdings, but to my emergence as Maxwell Ellis and the innovative approaches we were implementing across our business and philanthropic endeavors. I had initially found the publicity uncomfortable after years of deliberate anonymity, but had gradually recognized its value in reshaping narratives about wealth, power, and who deserves a seat at the table. "Do you need to return to the office?" James asked, noticing my attention to the message. "Financial Times interview at 2, I confirmed. They're featuring the Innovation Center in their special report on evolving philanthropic models." He nodded understanding. "I have meetings with the Community Advisory Board this afternoon anyway." He hesitated briefly, then added, "Dinner later? I've been wanting to discuss the mentorship program structure with you." I found myself smiling at the carefully professional framing of his invitation. Throughout our separation, James had maintained this deliberate balance, professionally engaged, personally respectful, never presuming upon our marital status or pressuring for reconciliation, despite the increasingly collaborative nature of our work relationship. "Dinner would be fine," I agreed. 8 o'clock at the penthouse? I'll have something brought in." A flicker of pleasure crossed his features before he resumed his professional demeanor. Perfect. I'll bring the latest mentor applications and program curriculum drafts. As the car carried me back toward downtown Boston, I reflected on the remarkable evolution of our relationship over the past 6 months. The initial shock and confrontation had gradually transformed into a productive professional partnership, with James proving himself a dedicated and innovative leader of the community development initiatives. More surprising had been his personal growth, the emergence of values and perspectives that seemed entirely at odds with his upbringing. His proposal to transform the family estate into an innovation center for women entrepreneurs had been just the beginning. Since then, he had consistently championed initiatives that challenged systemic inequalities, often drawing upon his own experiences of unearned privilege to illuminate the need for structural change. The James Westbrook who had sat silently, while his family called me a gold digger, had become an outspoken advocate for reconsidering how we value contribution and worth in society. The man who had unquestioningly accepted his inheritance as birthright now regularly spoke about responsibility and redistribution of opportunity. Was this transformation genuine and sustainable? All evidence suggested it was. The question that remained was whether it was sufficient to rebuild our personal relationship on a foundation of authentic partnership, rather than the unequal dynamic that had characterized our marriage. The Financial Times interview went smoothly, focusing on the Innovation Center's unique approach to supporting women entrepreneurs from disadvantaged backgrounds. The journalist seemed particularly interested in how my personal experience informed the center's mission. You built your fortune without the advantages of family connections or inherited wealth, she noted. How does that experience shape your approach to supporting other women entrepreneurs? I considered my response carefully. It made me acutely aware of the invisible barriers that exist beyond the obvious financial ones. Access to networks, to mentorship, to the unwritten rules of engagement in certain industries. These can be as significant as capital in determining who succeeds. And now you're married into one of Boston's oldest families, she continued. Has that insider perspective changed your view on these systemic advantages? The question touched on the personal in a way I typically avoided in professional interviews, but I recognized its relevance to the center's mission. It has deepened my understanding of how privilege operates, I acknowledged, not just in terms of financial resources, but in the confidence that comes from generational belonging, from never questioning whether you deserve a seat at the table. I paused before adding, the Innovation Center aims to provide not just funding and education, but that sense of legitimate belonging that many women from non-traditional backgrounds struggle to develop. After the interview concluded, I found myself with a rare free hour before my next commitment. On impulse, I directed my driver to take me to the small cafe where James and I had first met, long before I became Elise Westbrook, or he discovered I was Maxwell Ellis. The cafe hadn't changed much in the intervening years, still serving exceptional coffee in mismatched mugs, still attracting a diverse clientele of students, professionals, and neighborhood regulars. I found an empty table by the window, ordering my usual cortado and allowing myself to remember that first encounter. James had been so different from the wealthy men who typically expressed interest in me, less entitled, more genuinely curious about my thoughts and experiences. He'd asked questions and actually listened to my answers, showing none of the competitive conversational style I'd grown accustomed to in business circles. I had been drawn to his apparent lack of pretension, his seeming comfort with himself, rather than his family name. Only later would I realize how much of that had been youthful rebellion against his parents' expectations. a temporary departure from the Westbrook script, rather than a genuine alternative identity. Or had it been? Perhaps the James I'd fallen in love with had been authentic after all, a version of himself that family pressures and social expectations had gradually subsumed until the anniversary dinner crisis forced a reckoning with who he truly wanted to be. I thought that was you. The voice startled me from my reflections. I looked up to find Catherine Reynolds standing beside my table, her expression warm with pleased surprise. "Catherine," I greeted her, rising to exchange brief embraces. "What a lovely coincidence." "Indeed," she agreed, gesturing to the seat across from me. "May I?" "Of course," I invited, genuinely pleased to see the woman whose foundation had become a key partner in the Innovation Center's educational programming. "I was just meeting with some of our scholarship recipients," she explained, settling across from me. "This cafe has been my secret discovery for years. Wonderful coffee without the pretension of the Back Bay establishments." I smiled, not mentioning that this had been precisely why James and I had frequented it during our early relationship. A neutral territory where neither of us felt constrained by social expectations. "The Innovation Center construction is progressing beautifully," Catherine commented. "I drove past yesterday and was impressed by how the redesign manages to honor the architectural history while creating a more welcoming aesthetic." That balance was important to us, I acknowledged, the us slipping out before I'd consciously chosen it. Catherine's perceptive gaze caught the moment. "You and James have developed quite an effective partnership these past months," she observed. "Professionally speaking, of course." I sipped my coffee, considering how to respond to her gentle probing. Catherine had become something of a mentor figure to me over the years, one of the few people who had known aspects of my Maxwell Ellis identity even before the public revelation. "He's surprised me," I admitted finally. "Not just with his commitment to the community development initiatives, but with his willingness to fundamentally reconsider values and perspectives I'd assumed were immutable." Catherine nodded thoughtfully. "I've known 3 generations of Westbrook men," she mused, "each shaped by family expectations and traditions that left little room for independent thought. Yet each with moments of potential that mostly went unrealized." She stirred her tea contemplatively. "James seems to be breaking that pattern in remarkable ways." "He is," I agreed, though I still question the sustainability of such rapid transformation. "Understandably," Catherine acknowledged, "yet crisis has a way of revealing character rather than merely creating it. Perhaps what you're seeing isn't transformation so much as revelation, the emergence of authentic selfhood that was always there, waiting for the right conditions to flourish." Her perspective resonated with my earlier thoughts at the cafe, the wondering whether the James I'd initially fallen in love with had been the genuine article all along. "You're looking contemplative," Catherine observed with gentle amusement. "Am I intruding on personal deliberations?" I smiled ruefully. "Just considering the complex intersection of crisis, opportunity, and authentic identity." "Ah," she nodded sagely. "The eternal question of whether people can truly change or merely reveal different facets of themselves under varying circumstances." She gathered her things, preparing to leave. For what it's worth, in my 7 decades of observing human nature, I've found that people can indeed change fundamentally, but only when they discover something worth changing for that aligns with their deepest values. She rose, adding with quiet emphasis, and only when they're given the grace of being seen and valued for who they are becoming, not merely judged for who they have been. Her parting wisdom lingered with me as I returned to the office for afternoon meetings. The grace of being seen and valued for who they are becoming, not merely judged for who they have been. Wasn't that precisely what I had hoped for, but never fully received from the Westbrooks during my marriage? The opportunity to be valued for my character and contribution rather than judged for my lack of pedigree? And was I now extending that same grace to James as he endeavored to become someone different from the husband who had failed me at our anniversary dinner? These questions occupied my thoughts as I moved through the remainder of my workday, reviewing proposals, making decisions, and guiding the continued evolution of both Westbrook Holdings and Ellis Investment Group. By the time I returned to my Mind-D penthouse to prepare for dinner with James, I had reached no definitive conclusions, but found myself more open to possibilities than I had been in months. At precisely 8 o'clock, the elevator announced James's arrival. He entered carrying a portfolio similar to the one he'd brought to our estate tour that morning, along with a small gift bag I hadn't expected. "These just arrived at the office," he explained, handing me the bag. "I thought you'd want to see them right away." Inside, I found advance copies of the special edition leadership journals we'd commissioned for the Innovation Center's first cohort of entrepreneurs. The elegant journals featured an embossed cover with the program's motto, "Your worth is not determined by others' recognition of it." "They're perfect," I said, genuinely pleased with the quality and design. "Exactly what we envisioned." James smiled, the simple approval clearly meaningful to him. The curriculum team suggested including quotes from your Financial Times interview throughout the journal, if you're comfortable with that level of personal connection to the program. The suggestion touched me unexpectedly. For years, I had maintained careful separation between my personal story and my professional achievements, partly to protect my privacy and partly to ensure my success was evaluated on its own merits rather than as an inspirational narrative. The idea of deliberately incorporating my experiences into the Innovation Center's programming represented yet another evolution in my public identity. I think that would be appropriate, I decided. If my journey can provide useful context for the participants, I'm willing to share it more openly. Over dinner, a thoughtfully selected spread from my favorite local restaurant, we discussed the mentorship program structure, application process, and curriculum design. The conversation flowed with the ease of genuine intellectual partnership, each of us building on the other's ideas and respectfully challenging assumptions when necessary. As we concluded the business portion of our meal, James hesitated briefly, before producing one final document from his portfolio. "There's something else I'd like you to consider," he said, his tone shifting to a more personal register. "This isn't related to the Innovation Center or Westbrook Holdings." Intrigued, I accepted the document. A legal brief I initially assumed was related to some aspect of our business restructuring. Instead, I found myself looking at divorce papers, meticulously prepared but unsigned. I looked up in surprise, meeting James's steady gaze across the table. "I'm not filing for divorce," he clarified quickly, "but I wanted you to have these, prepared according to your interests and security, should that be what you ultimately decide is best." The gesture caught me completely off guard. Throughout our separation, we had carefully avoided discussing the final status of our marriage, focusing instead on rebuilding trust through professional collaboration and consistent respect. "You're giving me divorce papers?" I asked, still processing this unexpected development. James nodded, his expression serious but calm. I'm giving you freedom to choose our future based on what truly serves your happiness and fulfillment, not obligation or momentum or concern for my feelings. He gestured toward the document. You'll see it waives any claims to Ellis Investment Group assets, acknowledges your ownership of the estate, and provides for continued cooperation regarding the Innovation Center regardless of our personal relationship status. I studied him with new eyes, recognizing the profound significance of this action. The man who had once sat silently while his family tried to legally constrain me was now voluntarily offering me complete autonomy over our future, with no attempt to leverage financial or emotional pressure. I searched for words that could adequately express the complexity of my reaction. Not a request or an expectation, James finished for me. Just a recognition that true partnership can only exist between people who actively choose each other, not those who remain together out of inertia or fear of alternatives. He offered a small, somewhat rueful smile. If we have a future together, I want it to be because you genuinely desire that future, not because untangling our lives seems too complicated to attempt. The thoughtfulness behind this gesture, the prioritization of my agency and autonomy above his own desires, moved me in a way I hadn't anticipated. It represented perhaps the most profound evidence yet of James's transformation from the passive husband who had allowed his family's values to override his own judgment to a man capable of genuine emotional courage and self-reflection. Thank you, I said simply, setting the papers aside without making any immediate decision. This means more than you might realize. We moved to the living room for coffee, the conversation shifting to lighter topics. A book we'd both recently read, an art exhibition opening the following week, mutual acquaintances who had reacted with varying degrees of grace to my public emergence as Maxwell Ellis. There was an ease between us that felt both familiar and entirely new, the comfort of long acquaintance combined with the energy of discovering someone unexpectedly intriguing. As the evening drew to a close, I found myself reluctant to end this newfound connection. There's a site visit to the new downtown development scheduled for Tuesday, James mentioned as he prepared to leave. The community partnership team has some innovative proposals for the public spaces. Would you like to attend? I would, I agreed, walking with him to the elevator. Send me the details and I'll adjust my schedule. He nodded, then hesitated at the threshold, clearly wanting to say something more. Elise, he began, then paused, gathering his thoughts. Whatever you decide about the papers I brought tonight, I want you to know that these past 6 months, working with you as a true partner, seeing you fully embrace your brilliance without constraint, have been the most meaningful of my life. The simple sincerity of his statement touched something deep within me, a recognition of the genuine growth he had demonstrated rather than merely proclaimed. It's been illuminating for me as well, I acknowledged. To discover that collaboration can be more fulfilling when both partners bring their full selves to the endeavor. A flash of something, hope, perhaps, brightened his expression before he composed himself back into professional courtesy. Good night, Elise. Thank you for dinner. After he departed, I moved to the balcony with a glass of wine, gazing out at the Boston skyline as I contemplated the evening's unexpected development. The divorce papers represented both an ending and a potential beginning, the conclusion of our marriage as it had existed, and the possibility of something entirely new built on authentic partnership rather than compromised selfhood. The following morning brought a fresh perspective and a decision. I arrived at the office earlier than usual, reviewing the divorce papers once more before setting them aside and focusing on the day's priorities. By mid-morning, I had drafted a new document of my own. Not a response to the divorce papers, but a comprehensive vision for the Innovation Center's next phase of development. When James arrived for our scheduled meeting about the downtown project, I invited him to review this vision first. "This is remarkable," he said after reading through my proposal. "The extension into rural communities, the technology access, initiatives, the partnership with community colleges. It expands the center's impact exponentially." I nodded, pleased by his grasp of the concept's full implications. "It would require at least a 5-year commitment to implementation," I pointed out, "from both of us." He looked up sharply, understanding immediately what I was suggesting. "You're not signing the papers." "Not yet," I clarified. "I'm proposing an alternative approach, a deliberate choice to build something together that reflects our shared values and vision, rather than simply extending or ending what we had before." Hope and caution warred in his expression. "And our personal relationship evolves alongside our professional one," I suggested, "with the same commitment to honest communication, mutual respect, and recognition of each other's full capabilities." I smiled slightly. "Perhaps we could begin with dinner that doesn't involve business proposals or legal documents, just two people getting reacquainted outside the roles they once played for each other." The joy that illuminated his features was unguarded, genuine in a way I'd rarely seen during our marriage. I'd like that very much. As we turned to the business at hand, discussing the downtown development plans with renewed energy and synchronicity, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. 6 months ago, I had stood in a restaurant watching my world implode as my husband's family labeled me a gold digger, while unwittingly attacking the woman who actually owned their ancestral estate. That painful revelation had forced me to reclaim my authentic self, to step fully into my power without apology or constraint. What I hadn't anticipated was that it would offer James the same opportunity, the chance to discover who he truly was when freed from the suffocating expectations of family legacy and social position. The gold digger they had feared had indeed turned out to be a goldmine, not just of financial resources, but of vision, determination, and the courage to value oneself regardless of others' recognition. The ultimate irony was that in attempting to diminish me, the Westbrooks had inadvertently created the conditions for authentic growth, not just for me, but for the son whose potential they had unconsciously constrained. As we concluded our meeting and prepared to visit the downtown site together, I found myself reflecting on Catherine's wisdom from the previous day. People can indeed change fundamentally, but only when they discover something worth changing for that aligns with their deepest values, and only when they're given the grace of being seen and valued for who they are becoming, not merely judged for who they have been. Perhaps that was the most valuable lesson to emerge from this unexpected journey. True transformation of businesses, relationships, and individuals begins with the courage to see ourselves and others not as fixed entities defined by past choices, but as evolving beings capable of growth beyond our own and others' limited expectations. The woman who had hidden her light for others' comfort had reclaimed her brilliance without apology. The man who had allowed family expectations to override his authentic self was discovering a purpose and conviction all his own. And together, we were building something neither of us could have envisioned from within the constraints of our former roles, a partnership based not on prescribed positions, but on mutual recognition of each other's unique and evolving gifts. The gold in this story, it turned out, wasn't in bank accounts or property deeds, but in the discovery that our true worth exists independently of others' recognition or judgment, patiently waiting for the moment when we're finally ready to claim it without compromise. That moment had arrived, and with it, the freedom to write a new story, one where value isn't inherited or assigned, but created through vision, courage, and the willingness to see beyond appearances to the authentic gold that resides within. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.